Good day everyone. Our topic is all about Chapter 5, the Philippines under Spanish rule. Reason for the Spanish colonization. When King Charles decided to send an expedition to the Moluccas, his purpose was primarily commercial. Later, when Legazpi succeeded in founding Spanish settlements, the Spanish claim to the Philippines was sealed. As such, the Philippines were the possession or property of the King of Spain, and therefore a crown colony. Political changes. As a crown colony, the Philippines was administered by the Council of Indies. Even so, the Spanish officials in the Philippines were appointed by the King of Spain. In 1863, the Philippines as a colony was placed under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of the Colonies or Overseas Ministry, Ministerio de Ultramar. Local government. Under central government was the provincial government. Specified province which all were already recognized the authority of Spain were governed by civil provincial governors. Those that were not yet fully pacified and conquered were ruled by the military officers. In 1886, King ordered that the provincial governor should remain as judge only. The city and its government. During the first century of Spanish rule, there were only two cities, Cebu and Manila. As conquest and settlements continue, the Spanish created one city after another. This government was different from that of the town. It was called Ayuntamiento, equivalent to today's city hall, and consisted of alcaldes, regidors, of chiefs of police, a city secretary, and others. Propagating the Catholic faith. Many Filipino were converted to the Catholic faith by the first Augustinian that came with Legazpi in 1565. Later on returned to their old Aminist religion. The Augustinian order continued to send its missionaries to make converts. Missionaries spread Catholicism in around Manila, the Visayas, the Ilocos, Pampanga, and Pangasinan. In 1581, the Jesuits were not friars arrived in the Philippines. These missionaries worked hard to convert the Filipinos to Catholicism. The union of church and the state. Friars and Jesuits were closely identified with the church because they were an agent of the Spanish king. There was union of church and state in Spain, and the same union was introduced in the Philippines. The Governor-General had the authority appoint priests to the parishes while the clergy were active in the government and political powers. Example of officials who became acting governors general were Archbishop Francisco de la Cesta, Bishop Juan Arechaldera, Bishop Miguel Lino de Espeleta, and Archbishop Manuel Rojo. The church organization. In 1578, Manila became a diocese. At first, it was a mere suffragan of the Archbishopric of Mexico. Father Domingo de Salazar was appointed the first bishop of Manila. The church, like the civil government, had a court of justice called ecclesiastical court. Cases dealing with the laws of the church and those involving priests were tried there. The Inquisition. The Inquisition was an ecclesiastical office whose duty was to reach for heretics and those guilty of pressing or practicing religious doctrines that were contrary to the Catholic Church. There was no office of the Inquisition in the Philippines, but there was a representative or commissary of the Holy Inquisition in Mexico. It was the duty of his representative to ferret out heretics among the Spaniards. Therefore, they were subject to arrest. The introduction of printing. Most religion works to use the missionaries during the early years of Spanish rule were handwritten because it took much time to copy religious books. The Doctrians introduced the Philippines the art of printing. The first printing press they introduced was called xylography or printing by woodblock. In 1606, the Franciscan the Franciscan put up a printing press in Tayabas and printed Ligua Tagala, the Residencia and the Visita. The Residencia and Visita were introduced to stop abuses of high Spanish officials in the colonies. The Residencia was the public investigation and trial outgoing colonial officials. The Visita was secret investigation of an official's conduct as a public servant. Its purpose was to ensure the official will work honestly and efficiently. The Plaza Complex. The house of the natives were suited around a plaza or town, centered by bringing them close to the church, the convent, the marketplace, and the cemetery. This setup allowed the Spaniards to effectively administer and control the natives. The church easily regulated the activities of the Indians, whose residents were under the Pile of Bells or Bajo de las Campanas.
So next is the central government. So the central government, the Spanish authorities believed that their experience in Mexico and South America would lead them in the formation of the Philippines central administration. As a result, many aspects of these countries' governments have been incorporated in the Philippines. The laws of the Indies were applied in the Philippines just as they were in Mexico and Spanish America. So in the central government, the central government was headed by the governor and the captain general or governor general who was appointed by the King of Spain. As governor general, he was the king's official representative in the colony. He possessed vast executive, legislative, and judicial powers. So the governor general or general was the president or presiding officer of the audiencia. So we're gonna talk about audiencia later. He was also the vice royal patron in the Philippines. He was also the commander in chief of the armed forces. So there is what we call complice. So a complice was the right of the governor to suspend the operation of a royal decree or order relative to the Philippines if his opinion the said order or decree would not be beneficial to the administration of the country. The usual formula in exercising the right complice was I obey but do not comply. So for the complice, it is the right of the governor. So as of today, there is what we call governor, but it he or she is not a general. He's only called a governor. He also has the power of this, like in the past, but today, if we talk about governor, he has a lot of rights and power. Next is the Audiencia. So this is the Audiencia. The Audiencia was established in the Philippines in 1583 to administer justice to the aggrieved people in the colony. In the absence of a governor, or when he could not perform his duties in the Audiencia exercised political administrative powers. It is also it audited the finances of the government. The audiencia was a financial burden to the King of the Spain. Because of this opposition, the audiencia was abolished in 1589. It was reestablished in the 1595. However, it actually carried out its function in 1598 when it was inaugurated. So, for the economic changes, the encomienda. The encomienda, in principle, was not actually a piece of land, land, but a favor from the king, under which the Spaniard receiving the favor was given the right to collect tributes or taxes from the inhabitants of an area assigned to him. The man who received this favor was called encomiendero. The encomienda was therefore a public office. The number of people living in the encomienda and the value of the land on which the natives reside dictated its size. The rule limited the number of natives in an encomendero managed region to 300, and the value of the land was set at 2,000 pesos. An encomienda could be held for 3 generations at first, but it was later reduced to 2. So, encomienda, there were 3 kinds of encomiendas. The royal encomienda, which belonged to the king, the ecclesiastical encomienda, which belonged to the church, the private encomienda, which belonged to a private individual. So many were the abuses committed by encomienderos that the king abolished the private encomienda toward the end of the 17th century. The next is the forced labor. In principle, Spain's colonial system was the greatest of all colonial systems, with England, France, and Holland following closely behind. The laws of the Indies, for example, specified ways to keep natives from exploring while they were employed, while Filipinos were compelled to serve both the state and the church. The same Indies laws stipulated that locals who were ordered to work for either the state or the church be given their pay. Filipinos were forced to work in the construction of churches, roads, bridges, ships, and the hauling of and chopping of timber by Spanish officials in the Philippines. So next is the forced labor. So next is the conditions were set for forced labor called polo y servicios, which include in the following. So number one is that the Filipinos to be drafted for work must be paid for their work. Number two, that the Filipinos laborer should not be made to work in distant places where they could not return to their families. Number three, that the drafting of laborers should not coincide with the planting and harvest seasons. Number four, that men who are physically incapable should not be overworked. Number five, that forced labor should be resorted to only in cases of absolute necessity, and that the number of laborers drafted should be diminished as, as soon as laborers from other countries had volunteered to work. So the terms of the policy on forced labor appeared to safeguard Filipino workers against exploitation on paper. However, it was a brutal in effect because the laws against forced labor were broken. Filipinos, for example, were not paid their salary. They were separated from their families due to the fact that they were sent to far-flung provinces. They were not provided with food as required by the law, but instead had to fend for themselves. Furthermore, they were overworked, resulting in the deaths of thousands of Filipino laborers. This was one of the factors contributing to the Philippines' population decline throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. To be exempt from forced labor, a Filipino laborer had to pay a charge known as fala. This charge was too costly, and the laborer could rarely afford to pay it. So next is the tribute. The Filipinos were forced to pay a tribute to the Spanish colonial government in cash or in kind, in full or installments, in order to fund the colony's administration, particularly the construction of churches, government buildings, roads, bridges, and improvements in transportation and communication. The tribute was intended to show the Filipinos' devotion to the King of Spain. The sum was tiny when it was first imposed in 1570. So persons over the age of 16 and under the age of 60 were required to pay tribute. The tribute was raised in 1589, with a tiny portion of the proceeds going to the church. This was referred to as sanctorum. Due to public hostility to the tribute and the abuses associated in its collection, the king abolished it in 1884 and replaced it with the cedula personal. This is the modern equivalent of the Class A residence certificate. So taxes. The Filipino also paid other taxes in addition to the tribute. The predials, the Zamboanga Donativo, and the Vinta were among them. The diezmos prediales tax was a tenth of the land's yield. The Donativo di Zamboanga, enacted in 1635, was a tax designed specifically for the conquest of the island of Jolo. The Vinta, on the other hand, was a tax levied on the residents of various provinces along western Luzon's coast to help fund the defenses of the coast against Muslim pirates who attacked the Visayas and Luzon in search of slaves for their offshore trade. Next is the galleon trade. The Philippines had been trading with her neighbors long before the arrival of the Spaniards. The archipelago's trading center were Jolo and Manila. Manila became a significant commercial city in the region after the Spanish conquest and settlement of a large part of the Philippines. Early Spanish colonial officials supported trade between Manila and other East Asian countries since it was profitable and might make them wealthy in a short period of time. So ships from Japan, China, Thailand, India, Cambodia, Malacca, and Indonesia anchored in Manila to offload their rich cargoes. These were then sold at a great price in Mexico by Spanish traffickers. Following the protest of Cadiz and Sevilla merchants, trade restrictions were imposed. They claimed that the Oriental items coming from Manila were driving their products out of Mexico. The claim was refuted by the Spanish businessman in Manila. The trade prohibitions were not lifted by the king. The amount of commodities that could be sent to Mexico was limited to 250,000 pesos, and the amount that could be sent from Mexico to Manila was restricted to 500,000 pesos. The galleon trade was the name given to this trade over the Pacific. The payments were later increased from 300,000 to 500,000 pesos. Because the galleon trade was regulated, not everyone could participate monopoly. Only privileged individuals, including as high-ranking state officials, church officials, and galleon crews, were permitted to trade. Because the galleon commerce was so restricted, the Spaniards' prosperity in Manila was exclusively dependent on the success of the voyages to and from Mexico. English buccaneers took some of the galleons. Others, on the other hand, sank near Samar on Luzon's southern coast. The monopolistic galleon trade decreased during the 19th century when commercial liberty became a European policy. The government's monopoly on the galleon trade ended in 1811 when the last galleon from Manila left from Acapulco, Mexico. As other ports in the Americas, such as those in Peru and Ecuador, opened to Philippines trade, and the Manila Acapulco trade decreased even further. So next is the Mexican subsidy. Because of the country's dismissal economic situation, in general, Spaniards did not endeavor to improve, whereas the Philippines did. Spain was burdened. The Mexican government provided the Philippines an annual subsidy called the situado to keep the country from going bankrupt. The average subsidy is 250,000 pesos. This sum was sufficient to keep the Philippines colonial government afloat. The money, on the other hand, came from Filipinos in the form of salary. A major chunk of subsidies went to Spanish authorities, employees, and priests. When Mexico gained independence in 1821, the subsidy was eventually terminated. Next is the economic society. In order to properly implement an economic policy in the colony, Governor Basco formed the Economic Society of Friends of the country in 1781. This was accordance with the king's proclamation, which granted him to the authority to form a society of selected individuals capable of producing helpful ideas. To keep the society sustainable from the outset, major Spanish traders in Manila donate 960 pesos per year a substantial sum in those days. The society was divided into sections. So number one is the factories and the manufacturers. Number two is the industry and the popular education. Number three is the natural history. Number four is the domestic and foreign commerce and agricultural and rural economy. For the first time in the Philippines history, the society was able to export indigo to Europe as a result of these efforts. This happened in 1784. The society's activities were not restricted to agriculture and industry promotion. It has also established the Academy of Drawing in Manila in 1824, which provided scholarships to people interested in the dyeing arts. The association established an agricultural school in Manila in 1861 with the goal of instructing farmers in sophisticated agricultural techniques. So next is the government monopolies. So Governor Basco was also known for his role in the creation of government monopolies, the most notable of which was the tobacco monopoly. Basco advocated to the king that a tobacco monopoly to be formed in the Philippines, citing the benefits of such a monopoly. As a result, in 1780, the king issued a proclamation mandating the establishment of a tobacco monopoly. It was nevertheless founded in the colony in the year 1782. So the following were the provisions of the decree. So number one, the cultivation of the tobacco was prohibited except for the provinces selected to grow it. Number two, contraband sale of tobacco was forbidden. Number three, the government had the exclusive right to purchase all tobacco products, to inspect and classify the tobacco plant, and to prepare and manufacture cigar and cigarettes. And number four, the government had the right to prohibit the exportation and importation of tobacco by any agency not connected with the government. In other words, the government had the monopoly of the planting, inspection, sale, and purchase of tobacco, and its manufacture into cigar and cigarette. Other monopolies held by the government included those on wine and liquor, gunpowder, playing cards, and boy or anise. While these monopolies brought in a lot of money for the government, they were a burden of the Filipinos. Many farmers from the Ilocos and Cagayan Valley fled to Manila, disgusted with their situation. As a result, the population of tobacco producing provinces dropped, resulting in a neglect of agriculture and as a result, low profitability in those provinces. So next is the Royal Company. The creation of the Royal Company of the Philippines in 1785 was another landmark of Governor Basco's tenure. The company has a 8 billion capital. This sum was divided into 32,000 shares, each worth 250 pesos. The company's goals were to support the Philippines' progress by enhancing the colony's foreign trade with Spain and to improve the Philippines' natural resources by encouraging industry and manufacturing and agriculture. With the influx of foreign capital, the revenues of the government increased in spite of these incentives. The company failed in its twofold aims. So this failure may be attributed to the following causes. The Spanish merchants in the Philippines who had been accustomed to the profitable galleon trade did not cooperate wholeheartedly with the company. Number two, the company was not able to establish direct commercial contact with Japan, China, and India, so it had to buy commodities from these countries from the Manila merchants, resulting in paying higher prices for those commodities than in the countries where they came from. So number three, the company was not well managed because its officials spent their time in activities that were not connected with the promotion of the welfare of the company. And number four, foreign vessels instead of the company's vessels brought to Manila. Such items are groceries, canned goods, wine, and other European products. As a result of the failure of the company to implement its program for the Philippines, it was abolished in 1834. So, economic development, an overview. So, several factors accounted to slow development of the Philippine economy. So, number one is the majority of the Spanish authorities were slackers. inept, and ineffective. So, majority of the Spanish authorities were lazy and slack. Rather from harnessing the colony's natural resources, Spanish authorities and lesser employees were more concerned with enriching themselves in office. There were a lot of slackers among them who relied on government work to make a life. As a result, they refused to till the ground. Hand soiling was a humiliating experience for them. They were looking for a white collar jobs. So number two, there were numerous feuds among Spaniards, particularly between the clergy and governor generals on the one hand, and the high-ranking ecclesiastical officials and the friar courts on other. These quarrels depleted their vitality and caused them to become demoralized. Instead of helping the colony situation, they contributed to its functioning by fighting amongst themselves. So Spanish bureaucrats were notorious for their ineptness. It was rare that one of them was concerned about the Filipinos' well-being. So the Filipinos were to be exploited by the officials and staff. Under these circumstances, the people became unproductive and seemingly indolent. There was very little economic and social improvement in the life of the masses, while the colonial officials and the church hierarchy grew rich. So, according to the Spanish writer Thomas de Comin, said in 1810, in order to be a chief or a governor of a province of those islands, or Philippines, no training or knowledge or special services are necessary. All persons or Spaniards are fit and admissible. It is a quite it is quite a common thing to see a barber or a governor lackey or a sailor or a deserter suddenly transform into a alcalde or provincial governor, administrator, and a captain of the forces of a populous province without any counselor but his shrewd understanding or any guide but his passions. So for the conclusion, so the Spaniards conquered in the Philippines for 333 years. No unity, no proper government, divided tributes. Those are some reasons on why the Spanish easily conquered our land. Result of these are were adopted their culture, traditions, and even their languages, which we use until today. The Spanish took advantage of the already divided up people in the Philippines and easily dominated by them. When a Filipino tribe was planning to have a revolution, the Spanish would send another group of Filipino tribes to conquer their fellow Filipinos, which results of creating a stronger sense of division. If the Spaniards did not colonize our country, we can't have our religion today, the Christianity. We all know that they were the one who presented our today's religion, even they forced the Filipinos before. But still we adopted it and devoted with our strong faith. Due to their power, the Spaniards they became abusive to the Indios, which they discriminated in their own land. This results to the revolution of the Filipinos, and the Spanish showed how advanced and strong they are in terms of technologies and how to handle a war. So basically, the Spanish colonization here in the Philippines is not good, but it has benefits as we know because we adapted their cultures, their traditions, and even their languages. And to be exact, they were abusive. They did not care about Filipinos. They are our ancestors. So I think for sure the Spanish colonization is not as good. It's not good so far as we explained this topic. So thank you and God bless.